Guys, I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Lou and the team on corporate's impact on regional economic development. We're going to now transition to something that I'm really excited about. David Coulter is a guy who can speak to a lot of the things that we're talking about at this conference. But David's been a senior executive at JPMorgan Chase. He was the chairman and CEO of Bank of America. He was a special limited partner and played a critical role in Warburg Pincus, which is arguably one of the best private equity firms in the world. He's also on the board of Borrow Money, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's one of these so-called neobanks and has taken a unique approach. He's a CMU alum and also on the board at Carnegie Mellon. So not only is he a distinguished alum, but he's given back to Carnegie Mellon now with his wisdom. And I got to know him a couple of years ago. And what I would say about David, beyond all the sort of accolades, is I try to be respectful and not call him too often, but every couple of months I call David when I kind of feel a little bit stuck. And he has this ability to, like, in a 20, 30-minute conversation, ask a couple of the right questions, make a few suggestions that have been really helpful for my career. And so I really personally appreciate that on my level. And I thought just him sharing some of his wisdom with the forum would be great. And I asked him thinking he'd probably say no, and he said yes. So I quickly grabbed the slot, and here we are. David, maybe as a place to get started before we get to fintech and how finance is being transformed, as a tie to the last session, they were just talking about corporate's role in economic development. And you've created a really interesting platform out in Montana that may be an interesting kind of anecdotal way to tie the last session to this session, and then we'll get into finance and innovation and all of that.
Sure. Thank you, Sean, and thank everybody for being willing to listen to a little bit here. I apologize for my lighting. I have a lighting challenge today, and I didn't solve it before we got started. Sean also should have noted that I'm chairing the capital campaign at Carnegie Mellon, and if any of you are really inspired by what the corporate labs are doing, plenty of room for more support.
Awesome. Be careful what you ask for, David. You might get some inbound on that. So
I could probably talk about what I'm doing in Montana for this entire session. I'll decide to keep it short. I have been interested for a long, first of all, I had a working ranch in Montana for almost 20 years, and that's a cattle and horse ranch. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, right outside Pittsburgh. Thought I'd never, ever go back after going away to college, but I've ended up back in Montana. I've been interested in policy about jobs and inequality and technology. And I began to think about, I guess in short form, how do I create jobs in a rural economy, in a small business, demonstrating that all new technology doesn't have to be applied in urban centers. Really, the idea started in Montana, where people that work on the ranch in weather like we have now, very cold, like to redo old farm equipment. And we created an LLC and we called it Remade in Montana. And it's remaking a hay baler from the bottom up and things like that. And for a while I thought, well, maybe we'll just create a shop in town and help people get better vocational skills. But it never seemed a big enough idea to me. The big idea came as I was wandering around Carnegie Mellon, spending a lot of time in spite of the fact I was a Tepper grad and an economics PhD student, spending a lot of time in engineering. And I began to get introduced to additive manufacturing, 3D printing using lasers sometimes to create things that you couldn't create any other way. And so the aha moment for me was to say, well, if I could combine something that gives kids or young adults traditional vocational skills, and then the opportunity to move into additive manufacturing, traditional skills are mostly subtractive, new skills are additive. If I could begin to give a group of people those skills, they could certainly get jobs. So I decided to do it in a private entrepreneurship, public philanthropy form, or private philanthropy form. I found an entrepreneur that I'm backing. His name is Wes Toscano. And we've built a modern machine shop. We've been open for about a year, as I said, using both subtractive technologies and additive technologies. I guess we had a couple theses. One is to scale it much more rapidly than you would scale a normal machine shop. Most machine shops begin in people's garage, and they have a hard time moving out of the garage for lack of capital. And then to add a range of technologies that would be very unique to a shop like this in a region like Montana and the surrounding states. So we're up and running. We call it Toscano Machine. Any of you interested? The way to find out what we're doing is toscanomachine.com, Tuscano. And we're off to a really good start. The thesis seems right. I learned a vast amount about how much gets subcontracted in the US. I never knew it, but everybody that makes big products doesn't make all the small bits and pieces, and how shops operate. And it is a national business in spite of being situated in Big Timber, Montana. So it's been a real learning experience for me. And as I say, it's all about jobs in a small business, in a rural economy, using new technologies. And if it's successful, what we'll do is we'll start a vocational after-school program in Remade, Montana. And then if kids have a real affinity, we'll try to offer them paid apprenticeships in Toscano Machine. And hopefully we'll either have jobs for them there, or we'll certainly, with that skill base, be able to get them jobs. In exchange for my financial and real estate capital, which, I may get some back, but this is not a for-profit venture for me, but it is a for-profit venture for West Toscano. In exchange for my financial and real estate capital, he's agreed to keep a sustainable level of paid apprenticeship. So it'll be the best philanthropy I ever did. It won't be like you give $100,000 to the symphony and next year they're back for 200. If Wes is successful in building this business, which is all about building his own wealth and supporting his family, it'll be a sustainable business long term. So, Sean, that's probably
awesome.
too long.
I think a really important project when you started it, and you've got to imagine with everything going on over the last 6 months, an even more important project now. So that's cool. And I love everything I came up with wasn't big enough, so I dreamt this up. That is you in a nutshell. That's awesome. So that's great. Let's transition to innovation inside finance and maybe start with your board position at Borrow Money, right? So I want to talk about what they did that's kind of unique, but maybe if people aren't familiar with Borrow Money, just the elevator pitch would be helpful kind of context setting. So could you start just giving us the Borrow Money elevator pitch?
Okay. Borrow Money, soon to be solely Borrow Bank, is a digital-only bank. The first one in the U.S. with a full national banking charter. The theme is to support customers, especially customers maybe at the lower end of the scale or who are battling to stay financially afloat, or customers in the middle or that are just beginning to build their financial history, to help them with a range of products and services that don't overload them with late fees and stuff like that the big banks are forced to offer to support their physical infrastructure, and to let them build their financial health and financial history over time. We have a full 365 degree of the customer data since we built our own core deposit technology stack. And that's something that big banks still don't have. In spite of one of my alma maters being JPMorgan, I got a few checks recently, and I typically haven't been in a bank depositing checks for years. But I thought, well, I could do this on my own. So I pulled out a deposit slip, took them down to the JPMorgan Chase branch and put it in the ATM. And when I got home, I got a message that somehow they couldn't, I'd used the wrong deposit slip. We have probably 10 or 15 accounts at JPMorgan. So they wanted me to come into the branch. I went into the branch yesterday and I told them what accounts it should be in. Since it was Chase Retail versus JPMorgan Private Bank, they couldn't pull up the account I told them I had. So this deck with a lot of thought about the data structure. We'll have a 365-degree view of the customer. We won't, as many challenger banks, just about all challenger banks in the U.S. depend on sponsor banks to hold their deposit, actually act as the overall charter entity. We will be able to hold our own deposits. Our cost will be about 25, our operating expenses will be about 25% of a normal physical bank and probably 50% of a normal challenger fintech. That kind of cost equation allows us to create a virtual circle on, we don't have to charge late fees or ATM fees or things like that. So it provides a really good operating expense equation. And we started it from scratch 3.5, 4 years ago. We now have over 2 million customers, and we're moving from getting that national bank charter into a much more active growth path.
Yeah, I want to talk about that bank charter, because one of the things incumbents like to say when they talk about these charters is like, well, there is some incumbency advantage, right? And I think you guys started getting that charter a number of years ago. So it's obvious what the cost advantages you just laid out, but what was the process like to try to get on equal footing and get that bank charter?
Yeah, it was incredibly arduous. I felt like I was moving back in my banking days about 35 years, reading, there must be 50 different policies that have about third-party risk management and IT security and a whole range of credit risk issues. And the comptroller is very careful. It came from the chart from the OCC. They're very, very careful. One of the real advantages of getting it, Sean, and we do regard it at least a temporary moat in terms of competitive advantage. But one of the real advantages of getting it compared to some of the other people we compete with is you have to be able to show the comptroller a path to profitability. Unlike many SaaS companies that are growing like crazy, and sooner or later we'll figure out how to get profitable once we get big enough. So there is just an inherent advantage from an investor standpoint to have a clear path to profitability. And it really comes in, for us, a large part of being a bank, being able to hold the deposits and use them ourselves rather than have a sponsor bank hold them.
So no profitless prosperity for Varo, is that what you're saying? That this is growing so fast. So if you were to compare and contrast Varo versus, you did a bunch of innovation projects, I know, because we've talked about it at JPMorgan, at BOA. One of the things I think that's interesting that I talk to a lot of different companies about is sort of the similarities and differences between transformative innovation as a traditional startup and transformative innovation inside a bigger organization like JPMorgan or Bank of America. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the compare and contrast between Varo and those large corporate innovation projects?
Sure. First of all, I'd say, I think innovation and how you go about it is very situational dependent. And so Varo is much, much different, which was kind of an innovative idea from the start. Now we started. Sure. But at both Bank of America and Chase, I think it's pretty typical of innovation challenges at large organizations. At Chase, it was prior to the internet boom and bust. When Chase merged with JPMorgan, they had an entity called Lab Morgan, and it was totally isolated and standalone and very smart people. But that is very hard to do innovation in a large organization because it's an us versus them world. So I think one of the things that's important is, I think if you're going to worry about innovation in a large company, it almost has to be a burning platform. It has to be a unique challenge the organization is facing. And while you may decide to keep it distinct, I think it still has to be of the organization. And so it really requires leadership from the top, because my experience with big corporations is everything gets stuck in the middle. People at the bottom may want to change, people at the top may want to change, but the real inertia is in the middle. And oftentimes, middle managers would rather cut off their nose to spite their face. This thing is going to make our job much, much more difficult. It's going to, if they're successful in this little innovation unit, they'll make me take half my expenses out of an old-fashioned business. So that's really the big challenge. As I think back to my B of A days and JPMorgan days, mostly I think about all the difficulties as opposed to the successes. I remember I had just become CEO of B of A, and Schwab had just introduced the Schwab One account, which was a variation of the Merrill CMA account. And so I decreed that I want something like a Schwab One account in 1 month. A couple days later, I had 15 people from the Treasury Department come and sit around the conference table and tell me why it was absolutely good to destroy Bank of America's earnings, because everybody that had their money in a typical checking or savings account were going to use a Schwab One account. And so at one point I said, well, wait a minute, where do you all keep your money? You keep your money at Bank of America. And uniformly, they said, no, we keep it. We have a Merrill Lynch CMA and we have a Schwab One. And you just say to yourself, well, how could we possibly, if we won't use our own products,
right?
How could we possibly continue to offer them? What I've seen innovation-wise that works in companies, if there's really a burning need to make something happen, and the people at the top are willing to stay deeply involved in it and willing to explain to the rest of the organization why this is critical to our lifeline, then you may have some success. But I think there's tremendous inertia in big places to not be as innovative as they could be. You might debate me if you thought about Amazon today. You say Amazon's a gigantic company and it's still innovative and successful. But I think that culture at Amazon got set from the start versus something that's lived in a totally different economic model and suddenly has to change that economic model.
I think a good way to sort of illustrate the Amazon culture, which to me actually is more important than even the digital transformation, a lot of the other things you see people trying to do these initiatives, is this sort of culture of taking big swings. When Jeff Bezos wrote his first shareholder letter when he took Amazon public, he finished by just explaining math. Carnegie Mellon folks were supposed to be pretty good at math. He just said, look, I want you to understand this. If there's a 1 in 10 chance of 100x payout, I'm going to take that bet every day. And I think the question is, how many other C-level executives, I mean, we could all do that math, but how many of them would do that? And I think a lot of companies are trying to get digital multiples on their earnings like Amazon, missing that it's not just digital transformation, it's this sort of culture of taking these business model transformational risks that's part of it.
Of course, that 1 in 10 bet for him today is easier than it was when they first started.
Absolutely, right? Well, but those bets are getting bigger too. I mean, arguably, AWS is more valuable than a lot of the other pieces of the whole at this point. But going back to your point on needing to have a sort of catalyst, big companies focused on this, I do think for those listening who are at these big companies, for many of your companies, the last year has been that for your organizations. And so certainly some people are pulling back and hiding in the recession, but I do think we're seeing some of the corporates that talk to us kind of leaning in. And in some ways, this is not a political statement, but sort of just saying like a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Let's go ahead and try to innovate.
For the people at big companies, I don't mean to say it's impossible. I just mean to say it's really hard. And some have to be of the organization, but outside the organization, or of the organization, but you're really making change. And if you're really making change, there's going to be resistance there. And you have to have that support from the top.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. The other thing I want to talk about is putting teams together. Like we also want to talk about teams a little bit today. And so you've given me good advice on building teams and hiring and things like that. Maybe if you could just start, even before we get to innovation specifically, just when you're putting teams together and leaders are doing that, what are the advice you would give them as they start to build out their teams?
You actually almost hit on it in the prior discussion. When I think of teams, I also think of the importance of culture. To me, culture, not only what is your brand promise, not really the logo or the typeface or the copy, but what is your brand promise and how do you want people to behave in your organization to deliver it? I think culture and teams go hand in hand. And if you ask me, what do I think the hardest thing it is for managers to work on, it is that focus on culture. For me, when I ran Bank of America, it was a real learning experience. I happened to have somebody working in the HR department who was very interested in culture. She'd been my head of HR when I ran the corporate bank, and she was very opinionated, besides being very interested in culture. And so actually, she couldn't work with their colleagues anymore. So I said, well, why don't you go off and think about this culture thing as I get ready to be CEO? It was a gigantic education. I thought the CEO demonstrates how hard he or she is working, and everybody follows that lead. And you have a planning meeting, you lay out your objectives. It's totally different than that. I think you have to work on culture almost 100% of the time when you're CEO, and that's just another way of saying it's a key issue. And you got the time you got to run the institution, because this issue of what you want to achieve and how you want to achieve it, how you want the organization to work, has to be constantly reinforced. We'd have these meetings of 50 people or 200 people, and we'd agree on what we're going to do, and everybody is enthusiastic, and then we'd walk away, and I'd go off and do something else, and you shrank right back to the problems you had in the first place. So it almost has to be a drumbeat of, here's what we're going to do, here's how we're going to do it, here's the way we're going to behave, and that drumbeat keeps, and people don't believe you at first. So then you make it, you remind them, and then you go on to the next one. I just find most managers don't want to spend the time doing that. And I think it is absolutely crucial creating a team.
So if someone wants to do that, like what are the things they should put on their calendar to reflect that prioritization of culture?
When I took over B of A, I had a quantitative agenda and a qualitative agenda. I'd been there. I knew what I wanted to do. I knew the bad behaviors. I knew how I wanted people to behave. And so I almost approached it like any other analytical problem. Here are the key things we can do. One step would be, let's make everybody an owner of the stock. And here's why we're going to do it. And, a range of kind of 4 or 5 key events. And you lay them out for people and say, you're going to do it. And then you start. And you use those key events to reinforce the type of behaviors you want to see in the organization, and also this kind of challenging goals you're pointing the organization to. And you talk about it all the time. And you begin to feel like people must think I'm absolutely the dumbest guy in the world because I'm saying the same thing over and over and over 200,000 times. But it needs to be a drumbeat. And so I looked at how we move the culture just as I look at how do we buy a competitor company? What are the things we need to do to make this company believe we mean what we say, and here's the way we're going to behave, and here's the way we're not going to behave. And everything ties into that. What kind of performance you will reward, and why you reward it, and how you talk about it.
What about hiring? How did it impact how you thought about hiring people?
Well, I think that's one way of thinking about teams.
Okay.
I'm on the board of another company right now that it's a group of friends of mine that have a kind of turnaround fund. And so they take companies that are somewhat distressed. And we've just gone through a strategy change and CEO change. We brought in a new CEO, and this is his 5th time as CEO. So he's done this. It's in the healthcare business, and he's knowledgeable of the industry. And he is a big believer. So he actually has people evaluated on their cultural traits as he puts together his team on, and as he thinks about what traits do I want the CFO to have, what traits do I want the general counsel to have, what traits do I want the chief operating officer to have. And well, I think culture is very important. I tend to resist these tests that tell you exactly who you are, but he's got about it in a very analytical way, and there is some logic to it.
So we're going to have a little bit of talking. Some of the organizational behavior professors are talking a little later today about some of this as well. But I'm curious, like if you didn't like using the quantitative tests in the companies you ran, like what did you use to more qualitatively feel it out?
Well, mine were more in the big challenges I had. And these are bigger companies, and we're not talking necessarily borrows of the world, but
Sure.
I had an idea of, I had a fairly clear agenda I wanted people to buy into. I had a view of how they manage with transparency and openness. Did they kind of adapt the status quo, or were willing to were they realistic about who we were strategically? I think that's the hardest job of strategy, being utterly realistic about who you are and who your competitors are. Maybe 5'6" and dribble the basketball really well, but we get a team of people 6'5", and so I look for those kind of skills in people, and you get it wrong, and I guess the other big lesson I learned: when you get it wrong, fix it quickly.
Awesome. Okay, we've just got a minute left, and I didn't preview this for you because I just wanted your off-the-cuff answer on this. Rewind the clock to your coming out of grad school at Tepper. I guess at the time it was GSIA. But imagine it's 2020, so now it really is Tepper. What advice would you have for someone just coming and starting their career today, coming out of Tepper?
I'm glad we only have a short time to talk about that. Look, I'm biased. I think GSIA and Tepper was absolutely the right place for me. Highly analytical, really focused on model building, problem solving, skills I still use today, day in and day out. Frankly, at that time, there was very little understanding of what it's like to be in an organization, how they grow. I guess the main advice I give people is they think about either going down the startup route or the big company route or somewhere in between, is try to find a place that has a fair number of branches on the tree that gives you the chance to maybe going down one path, but let's take another. That's why I tell people if you go to work for a family company, there are very few branches on that tree. If you don't like the owner. So I talked to him a bit more about, we never had much discussion of teams and organizations and innovation and stuff like that. There's kind of innovation, given what you're doing, there's kind of innovation impetus, but I found the Tepper people much more quantitative than most others.
That's awesome. David, thank you on behalf of Carnegie Mellon. I mean, chairing the capital campaign, all the things you do for us is amazing, but also just on a personal level, you've been a really great counselor and advisor to me. I really appreciate you making the time today, David.
Thank you. I hope it was a little worthwhile here today.
It was awesome. It was absolutely awesome. Thanks so much.